interrogation.
Yeah, it's very bright, isn't it?
How are you?
I've got a mic, yeah. Yeah, it works. Can I ask you to take your seats and we'll make a start? Could I ask you to take your seats as quickly as possible, please, so we can make a start? So, buona tarde, good afternoon, and welcome to this roundtable session where we'll be discussing the future of the OECD-UNESCO guidelines on quality provision in cross-border higher education. What we're going to do is start with a little bit of an explanation of what that means, what those guidelines are, what cross-border higher education is even. We will then turn to a colleague who has written prepared a paper which is published as part of the knowledge outputs of this conference, which is looking at a review of the ongoing relevance of these guidelines, which were adopted in 2005, so quite a while ago, and really the objective today is to discuss the ongoing relevance or not of these guidelines and what perhaps needs to be done to improve their implementation or make these guidelines more relevant to actual practice in higher education in the world. I'm joined on the stage by Achim Hoppach, who is an expert in higher education quality assurance, previously managing director of the Austrian Quality Assurance Agency, by Susanna Karakanyan, who was until recently the president of INQAHE and works for the quality assurance body in Abu Dhabi. I'm joined by Angela Lampkin, who is head of qualifications and information and learning opportunities at the Quality and Qualifications Ireland, so the main quality assurance and recognition body in Ireland, by Qingling Kong, who is from the UNESCO Higher Education Secretariat, the UNESCO Secretariat, the section for higher education, and by my colleague Thomas Wieko, who is the head of the OECD Higher Education team. My name's Simon Roy. I'm also a member of that team. So to start with, just a little bit, I'll get out of the way, a little bit about the objective of what we're going to discuss today. So we wanted to broaden it a little bit and talk about and we will talk in the roundtable about some of the challenges relating to quality and recognition facing students in cross-border higher education. Then looking a bit about the question of what needs to be done and who needs to do it. So that's basically the objective of what we'll be talking about. This is part of a broad, as I kind of mentioned, there's an ongoing review by both the OECD, one of the bodies responsible for these guidelines, and UNESCO, which is also the origin of the paper that Achim will talk about. That is a review of this legal instrument and what purpose does it serve and how can it be made better. Just a quick word about what is cross-border higher education. This is not actually as straightforward as perhaps you might think. The guidelines from 2005 are extremely broadly defined. They cover all forms, a large range of types of higher education where either students or providers cross borders. What it actually includes within the definition in those guidelines is student mobility and staff mobility, where those students and staff cross borders. However, when students and staff cross borders, they typically enter a domestic higher education system, and then they're entering the whole legal framework and regulatory framework of that higher education system. So there's a degree to which the question of quality assurance and recognition to some extent is less problematic in that kind of standard model of cross-border mobility. Where we see, and where one of the origins of the guidelines at the time, perhaps potential for greater problems, is where higher education providers located in one country provide their higher education in another country, whether that is through various forms like franchise programs, branch campuses, so that's where they direct provision, or increasingly, of course, online higher education provided from one country into another. And then they have various forms of cooperation or collaborative cross-border provision where you have joint programs and so on. So you have a kind of actually relatively complex network of activities that are going on. Really the focus is a bit on this concept of transnational education, which is sometimes also called international program and provider mobility, so that when providers cross borders rather than exclusively when students cross borders. Just very quickly, student mobility has increased in general as a part of the internationalization of higher education. This data on where providers are providing higher education across borders is very scarce, basically. Relatively few systems collect this data. One of the countries that does collect data is the United Kingdom, where what they collect is the enrollment of students in different forms of higher education that is provided in other countries by higher education providers based in the United Kingdom. So this is just showing that there's basically been an increase in those kinds of provision, particularly in terms of collaborative provision, which is where you have joint programs with other, with operators in another country, and distance, flexible, and distributed learning. A lot of that is online learning, of course. So what you have is that growth, to a large extent, from one of the main exporting countries of higher education, but that's a pattern that you can expect to see from other major exporting countries of higher education. Just very quickly on what the guidelines say, and then I'll hand over to Achim to look at some of what has been the assessment of the ongoing strengths and weaknesses. These are guidelines that basically call for learners in cross-border, in transnational education, to be informed well about a range of things, including the likely recognition that they're going to get for the qualifications that they're being offered. It's also looking at how quality can be assured in those programs, how recognition should be organized, and how cooperation between international bodies should be promoted. But in all of those cases, and it makes recommendations to those six types of bodies, including governments, but also education providers and student bodies, but it does so actually at a rather general level. So by definition, it's a global guidelines. They are quite general, and that's something we will come on to in our discussion, I think, today. So basically what I'm going to do is hand over to Achim, who will tell us a little bit about the review that he's carried out of the guidelines, and then we will start a roundtable discussion and then open the floor to the audience. So Achim, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this roundtable discussion. What I'm going to do is I will very briefly talk about this background document which I produced for this conference. It was an analysis about the OECD-UNESCO guidelines, how they were implemented and what role they play today. They were adopted in 2005. That's quite a while ago. And the framework conditions have changed significantly in the meantime. I will be very brief because I think either you know how these have changed, or you can imagine at least. Diversification in higher education is a phenomenon which is also applicable to cross-border higher ed. Diversification in terms of the types of providers that are in the field, and also the type of provision. One important framework condition that has changed important when we talk about quality assurance is that national quality assurance arrangements or systems are quite widespread around the globe today, which was not the case in 2005. The third changing framework condition out of a couple which are mentioned in the paper that I want to highlight, because I think it's a very important one. In higher ed, the global regions gained a lot importance when it comes to policymaking, soft policymaking, when it comes to quality assurance standards or agreements. And this level of collaboration and policy making didn't have that relevance in 2005, which it has today, and this is to be kept in mind. Very briefly about the implementation of the guidelines. OECD ran 2 rounds of analysis of the implementation of the guidelines, and the results were quite similar. They are broadly accepted and well implemented on the one side. On the other side, the 2 rounds of analysis told us that there is quite little awareness when it comes to many stakeholders. And what came out is that although they are implemented everywhere, there is no coherent framework evolving. And I will come to this problem: broad acceptance and implementation, but no evolving coherent in a minute. The aim to have a framework for cross-border higher ed, or I will only focus on quality assurance, is still relevant to today. And one reason is that a couple of challenges that existed in the years late 1990s and up to 2005, they are still there. And I mentioned only a few of them on this slide. Lack of accessible information about cross-border higher ed and quality assurance. This is still an issue for those of you who work in the field. They will immediately agree that we have this issue. And cross-border higher education is still, in 2022, not included in all national quality assurance arrangements. There are some new challenges. I already talked about the diversity of providers and provision, and one challenge is that although it is a growing market and quality assurance is maturing, we don't have a real kind of agreement what should be at the core of quality assurance of cross-border higher education. Now, some of you will not agree with me. And to those I should say that I was generalizing because of one very relevant challenge, and from my point of view, maybe the biggest problem that we have. And this is the big divide between those countries that are receiving countries or sending countries of cross-border higher ed, which have very mature and well-established system and others. And this divide is, from my experience, getting bigger. We have a couple of quality assurance systems and agencies that have a lot experience and have mature system. And on the other side, we have very old, traditional, and well-established higher education system where the ministries and all the universities just don't know how to deal with this topic. And this divide is one of the biggest problems. Now, coming back to the funny issue that the guidelines have been implemented and that they are well accepted, but there is not really something like a framework, which was the aim. Well, the thing is that the guidelines mainly call the stakeholders that were mentioned to take their responsibility and to collaborate. And these principles, which are still valid and important, are quite easy to agree with. But the guidelines didn't give any more precise guidance what this should mean in practice. And this was overtaken, we could say, by regional arrangements, just like Mercosur, ESG in Europe, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa. These regional arrangements for quality assurance gave a lot of guidance how quality assurance should be conducted, gave a lot of guidance how the agencies should look like, and compared to these, which are quite concrete. The OECD, UNESCO guidelines are very acceptable but very general. So the impact is much lower than the impact of these regional guidelines. So the recommendations in this paper are very briefly that there should be something like such a global framework, which with very clear standards, what should be in and what should be out. And one of the most important standard is to address the specifics of provision of higher ed cross borders, which is not the case in many national QA systems if they address cross-border higher ed at all. The second one is very straightforward. Cross-border higher ed has to be included in national quality assurance arrangements. The next one addresses a big problem that we still have in many countries. It is not always clear what status the qualifications obtained in cross-border programs have in the sending country and in the receiving country, and that's an issue for the students. So this needs to be addressed in a framework. And as I already mentioned, such a framework should go beyond broad principles and give more guidance about the structures and procedures. I have to be very brief with this. Of course, the world has changed and is changing. Higher ed is changing, and designing a framework today or developing a quality assurance framework today means it has to be innovative and take into account all these new developments in higher ed. And the framework should be based on what has happened at regional level and should use the regional levels in order to get more impact at the national level. The regional level has proven to be so powerful in designing quality assurance arrangements that this global framework should be based on these regional approaches. And finally, which really concerns me a lot, and which and what might be a role for you, UNESCO and OECD, we have to overcome this divide between countries that are the forerunners that know about cross-border higher ed, what the challenges are, how to address the challenges, how to design and implement quality assurance arrangements, and those countries that are newcomers and that don't really know how to deal with these questions. This was a very quick run through, and I'm looking forward to the panel.
Thank you very much. Akim? If I, speaker?
Microphone? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Not enough professionalism in this. If we then turn to picking up the point that you raised about the ongoing challenges in this area, and I think we can maybe start by taking a step back and looking and asking the panel to reflect on that question of what do they see as the main challenges in this area of cross-border higher education, in particular the issue of crossing, of when providers are crossing borders. If I can turn to Susanna, you're first. You have experience, obviously, as in the global network of quality assurance agencies in INQUAHE, and also in your role in a country in Abu Dhabi where there's also a major receiving country of cross-border higher education. What would you say? What's your reflection on sort of the main areas of outstanding challenge in this field?
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much, Achim, for a very nice presentation of your findings. Very useful. I would agree that, this is really clear that in 2005 being adopted these guidelines for quality assurance in cross-border higher education, and now we're in 2022, there has been a lot of changes. And the higher education system changed itself, the whole paradigm changed, and the quality assurance itself has changed, it matured enough. If Achim rightly mentioned, we had very few higher education, national regulators or quality assurance providers like back in 2005. Now we have around, as a global study demonstrates, INQUAHE global study demonstrates, we have around 350 accreditors, quality assurance providers globally. And out of this, 20% of them are doing quality assurance across the borders. So it's not only higher education that has evolved, the quality assurance itself is traveling across the borders. So apart from tackling the issue of higher education provisions, we also need to look to come up with standards, guidelines for the quality assurance providers who are traveling across the borders to maximize the impact on the potential accreditation mills and frauds that could happen in all these provisions. When it comes to higher education, so we agree that there are two now major things, like higher education itself, the provisions, and the quality assurance that are traveling across the borders, and we need to have arrangements for both of them. As at INQUAHE, we have been working, and we have had a whole methodology for the whole year. We have been working on developing the standards and guidelines, and it became clear with talking throughout all the stakeholder consultations we had and meetings with different regions globally that this is the issue of cross-border higher education is tangible, majority of the systems, it's not that they are aware of it, they are aware of the guidelines, but what is lacking is the implementation mechanisms. The implementation mechanisms on how to make sure that the quality assurance of cross-border higher education is in place is yet to be developed, and the countries need to be guided on how to, or supported, the governments need to be supported on how to work with cross-border higher education and set up the frameworks that are actually guiding the systems and safeguarding the system from bogus providers, accreditors, and higher education providers themselves. So they should be frameworks safeguarding the system. That's clear, and the government is responsible for that. When it comes to specific context in the United Arab Emirates that you mentioned, which is one of the biggest receiver of the cross-border higher education, I would say that contexts matter. When the education crosses the border and moves from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, things are changing. We look at the faculty profile, you look at the admission criteria, you look at the graduation criteria. Well, and the guideline is there that it should be of equal provision. So how to ensure that this equality is still there? For example, if we send the students to the US, we're not sending them only for the institution or the credential. We're sending them, they are predominantly traveling to those Western developed systems for the faculty, to get the knowledge of the faculty, and also have access to the internships, to have access to the market that is out there, and how to make sure that we provide all these setups necessary across the borders in a different context.
Yeah.
So contexts matter.
Yeah.
And we have to be building everything around those contexts. The contexts need to be one of the top areas of standards we're setting for both higher education and quality assurance, likewise. And those frameworks that need to be developed, by the way, in Kwahe, Achim is talking about a lack of the cross-border higher education framework. It's true, but Kwahe has come up with the Open Knowledge product, which we shared through UNESCO World Higher Education Conference, where we are talking about two sets of standards. We come for quality assurance of cross-border higher education and quality assurance of quality assurance bodies that travel across the borders.
Right. So
this is two separate sections we are providing there, and we hope that that would be useful in setting the frames for future discussion. Thank you.
Very good. If I may turn to Angela, you're working primarily in the area of recognition, but within a quality assurance body in a country that is to some extent a sending country, but also a receiving country. I wonder what your reflections on this question of the challenges you see, either for students or for providers or for other parts of the system.
From a recognition perspective, certainly my view would be that a strong qualification system is something that we would rely very heavily on. And in Ireland we have a 10-level framework of qualifications, and I think it's the fact that we have it recognised then in reference to the European qualifications framework that gives it a currency in Europe at least. So there is that kind of a recognition for learning that will be achieved in Ireland, and if it's a cross-border type programme, that is also quality assured, so it's part of our system, and we have the quality assurance mechanisms in place so that the qualifications made are going to be recognised in that context. There are other, for a small country like Ireland as well, we export many of our graduates, for working abroad, etc. And we also have entered into arrangements from time to time with other jurisdictions where we've referenced our framework of qualifications to the Hong Kong Qualifications Secretariat's framework, and also to the New Zealand qualification systems. So they obviously came to us with that request, looking for, you might say, parity of esteem, but not quite parity of esteem, but a recognition type arrangement where we could agree to advise and to accept qualifications from the relevant jurisdictions for good purposes, for moving into higher education, for moving into employment, or whatever the case may be. So, but we have strong legislation in Ireland which underpins the establishment of our framework. And I suppose the other point I'd make, Simon, is that we have a register now of qualifications as well, which is something that I know is in discussion around as well, in terms of having a system where we can provide information for learners, information for the regulatory bodies, whether they're in Ireland or beyond our borders, so that they can check a programme and they can find out what the recognition, you might say, of that particular programme will be. Because often it's being funded by a third party. And I mean, that's often very important, I think, when it comes to cross-border education and mobility, is that somebody is funding that learning. And that learning, you have to get that value for money at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. If we then, I mean, I suppose on this, keeping this general focus on the question of challenges, I mean, if I turn to our two international organizations here, perhaps from the OECD side, and to start with Thomas, I mean, what, if any, I mean, how do you see the challenges in this sector? I mean, I know it's something that we've struggled with a little bit in terms of working on, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, from the OECD perspective, and I'll be parochial for a moment and think about 38 member countries. So these are, and I want to go back to Achim's observation that sort of we're working with a lot of systems with sort of relatively mature and robust systems, many of which, of course, are inside of the European framework. So I think, you know, our exposure as we work with our countries and as we sort of look closely in those systems, to be perfectly frank, you know, we're seeing that it's pretty well sorted. Yeah. On balance, right? I think, obviously, and going back to the very helpful little taxonomy that you provided in the beginning, Simon, sort of breaking out what is cross-border higher education. I suppose, you know, we're assuming that, you know, with the movement of students, that's relatively well covered by domestic provision. A lot of the systems have matured, as in the case of Ireland, with a really sort of robust qualification framework, so the recognition problems are pretty well managed. I suppose it might be the case that the problems arise most importantly in that sort of independent cross-border provision. We would see those occur, assuming that in the sort of collaborative cross-border provision, the risks are somewhat lower, because that, again, falls inside the framework. Obviously, in another sense, we don't really have, at the OECD, we like to have good evidence. We don't have a robust base of evidence about problems, right? That's not something that we sort of systematically see. But I think that's probably where it's likeliest to occur. I think in our case, and we'll say this for a little bit later, a lot of the question comes around, I think, at the OECD is, given all of the changes that have taken place in the maturation of national systems and of networks of national systems, what role is there to play for international organizations within that maturing framework? But we'll come to that soon.
I'm tempted to ask Achim too, but I'll turn to Qingling first. What, from your perspective, which is in a sense the global, so Thomas is right that we work at the OECD now with what is 38 member countries, an increasingly diverse set of countries, but nevertheless the definition of the OECD is that they're sort of those somewhat wealthier countries with in general more developed quality assurance systems on average, although there are major exceptions like the United States, I guess. But within your global perspective, I guess, I mean, in the work that UNESCO is doing, do you have reflections on the challenges in this area?
Yeah, sure. I think when we come back to the simple term of cross-border higher education, the challenge is we are crossing borders, judiciary borders. We're dealing with different national systems, regional systems, and international systems that are not the same. And we're looking for comparability. We're looking for transparent information that is available for us to make the decision. So this is a major challenge. And if I can put the challenge in a simple way, just to be oversimplified, is how can we stay united while divided? Dividing because we are different countries, there are different cultures, and judicial traditions and linguistic traditions that we would like to preserve and foster. So that means the responsibilities of the different people and actors in these systems and countries are different. We need to know how do we divide the responsibilities, and then we know how do we share the responsibilities in the united process. And then I think Angela, Susanna, you touch upon the quality assurance, traveling across borders, and then the recognition, which is exactly what UNESCO is doing. I think many of you here might be aware of the 5 complementary UNESCO regional conventions on the recognition of qualifications. And then in 2019, there is the Global Convention on the Recognition of Qualifications in Higher Education that was adopted by UNESCO. And the challenges we're facing building up to this whole process is really how do we bring the global actors and countries to come together, even agreeing on a term, the definition of quality and recognition and accreditation is a discussion that can last for hours. So this is the challenge we're talking about. And from my own perspective, I'm thinking the challenge is about establishing a social contract built on very strong social capital, because all the guidelines, the conventions, and the guidelines also from INCAHE and the regions, they are not legally binding. And the fact that we need to abide by the guidelines or refer to them really builds on consensus that we can seek in the room. I think this is also the discussion today and why we're here. So I will stop here and then we can deal with other issues.
Very good.
More specifically.
Before we turn to the question of what is to be done, maybe Akim, just a quick follow-up to you, because you identified in your paper this sort of variation in the maturity of quality systems that some, perhaps my interpretation is including in OECD countries, for example, in terms of their ability to quality systems to sort of take care of the higher education that is exported from their country, but equally obviously in many other parts of the world, which are perhaps more predominantly receiving countries. What's your, in terms of that split that you see, I mean, can you just perhaps elaborate a little bit on how that works geographically?
Well, that's an interesting question. And it is interesting because we are not talking about well-established quality assurance systems on the one side and newcomers on the other side. This is not exactly the divide I am talking about in the paper. The divide is between those countries for which cross-border higher ed plays an important role, and the others that maybe don't even know that they have foreign universities offering programs in their country. And then there's this small group of countries that are the traditional sending countries and have a well-established quality assurance system, which then would normally also cover cross-border higher ed. But there are also others, some very eminent OECD member states where incoming cross-border higher ed or outgoing cross-border higher ed is not very relevant. And typically they don't have very sophisticated arrangements for quality assurance of cross-border higher ed. But it does not mean that they are not sending and receiving cross-border higher ed. But it's not at a level that everybody would talk about. And this causes a lot of problems because there's a lot flying under the radar. So this is the divide. And to be honest, this to a certain extent goes along with the north-south divide, and this is really a global problem. But it's not only a north-south divide; it's also within the north. A couple of well-respected higher education systems I know have ministries and quality assurance bodies that they don't know what I'm talking about, and there is a lot going on in terms of cross-border higher ed, also in these countries.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. If we then, I mean, so establish that there's a pattern of there's variation in terms of the extent to which cross-border higher education is taken into account in national systems, both in the sending and the receiving countries. That's kind of a key message. There's still that variation. There's some very developed, some very underdeveloped. What, Susanna, do you think, I mean, in terms of, you've already started to allude to some of the possible ways forward, but what do you see, both, I suppose, what needs to be done, and then the related question, who should do it, which inevitably in this area is, we assume there's some role for international bodies in this. So I wonder if you have reflections in terms of the way forward or things that need to be done and who should do them.
Very good question. Thank you very much. And I don't think that there is one body that should be taking care of it. There are multiple players that should join the efforts to make sure that this happens and it works, actually. But given I'm representing an international network of quality assurance bodies, I would share our role in it, how I see it. And basically, it's multifaceted. It could take a lot of different forms. One of them is predominantly capacity building. What Achim is referring to, the countries even not knowing that cross-border education is happening in their countries. So this talks about the major need for capacity building. And we had this call for capacity building coming from all the regions that we covered during our stakeholder consultation throughout this couple of months of studies with, to prepare our standards and guidelines for international standards and guidelines, which also include cross-border education and cross-border quality assurance.
Could I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so I understood his remarks. I made a note between sort of capacity and awareness. So I was fascinated by Achim's remarks that there are governments, there are actually countries with capacity. They have some governing capacity, the quality assurance bodies have capacity, but they're actually, it's not visible, or it's visible but not a priority, and they're not doing anything. And then you have other systems where you need to build capacity.
Yep.
So we have kind of two sets of problems, right? So there could be systems in North America that, for example, just sort of aren't paying attention, right? They're sort of going under the radar about some of these aspects of cross-border provision, and they're not making it a priority, even though in principle there is the capacity. And then you have another set of countries where you really need to focus on capacity building. Is that a fair description, do you think?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And capacity building is one of the major things that there is actually a cry out for it from different systems that we need to do that. Many of the systems, we heard from many of the systems that, well, maybe there are some institutions that are international institutions placed in our context, but it's beyond the frame of our reference. The government policy doesn't cover it, so we're not interested in it. But it's good to know, good to learn from it. So these were some of the reflections that we received, which means that it's not only the quality assurance bodies, this is a broader, the governance frameworks at the higher education levels in each country, the system level, they also have to be considering this. So we take it to the policy-making level, to the governance of higher education, and then creating a link between quality assurance and the overall governance and regulatory and legal and regulatory frameworks. Then the other actors could be like higher education institutions themselves. that are traveling across the borders, because they are used to the systems in their own jurisdictions. When they travel to the jurisdiction that they are placed in, they faced a lot of challenges. They're not used to the reporting mechanisms. They're not used to the compliance with the KPIs or all other things that just name it. So they encounter a lot of issues, especially if the funding comes from that specific government and not from them. So there are a lot of things that need to be considered. But going back to the international network, what else we could be doing? The key thing that we should be doing, and a lot of regional networks, not a lot, sorry, 2 or 3 regional networks are already covering that well, like European Network of Quality Assurance is already covering that well, or in the US we have already, the US has a very well established system of recognizing the quality assurance bodies who are doing actually the reviews. But at the global level, we have the guidelines of good practice for INCWAHI, which we are turning into the international standards and the guidelines, with the purpose of promoting trust and credibility in the quality assurance that is traveling across the borders. So what is the next expectation from those bodies, regional or international networks, is to promote trust and credibility in those cross-border higher education and quality assurance. And at the end of the day, what matters is the student, the recognition of the qualification. And going back to the recognition of qualifications, look at the qualifications frameworks globally. The recent analysis demonstrates that, well, majority of them have it, but very few have it linked to their own needs of the system. Very few have it linked to the quality assurance systems that are actually promoting its constant enhancement, linking it to the recognition. We are very good at setting soft regulations, and we are nicely doing it, but when it comes to implementation mechanisms, this is where we are lagging big time. So we have to be taking it to a level deeper and lower.
I think we're getting,
for the
I think we're
implementation.
moving. Are we moving
Yeah.
to that next level? You know,
Yeah.
you talked about trust and capacity building, and many of us have been engaging in that capacity building and trust for so many years. But I do think now maybe there is a stronger connection coming about quality assurance, recognition, and qualifications framework. So there are pillars, if you like.
Yeah.
So when they come together, you know, maybe we're in a better place. But I will say, you know, I do think there is that learner at the center of these things that we need to remember. They will also vote with their feet. So they will move and they will engage in education programs where they know that they will get a recognized qualification that will move them into the job market, into a professional career as appropriate. So, you know, we also have to look at them and maybe learn from what is the experience that they have had that might be better than another experience in their home country, perhaps, or in another partnership country. So we got to look at good practice maybe around these areas. And I mean, there's so many examples of good practice I think that we can look at.
Do you, you're involved in the Europe, particularly in the European networks for recognition, I believe. But
There's a lot of work going on there at the moment. There are European projects going on with the European Universities Alliances. I think some of them, they're not quite there yet. I'm not directly involved myself, but I think these will prove, again, building trust, partnership, engagement, doing that field work where you're visiting the various jurisdictions, you're assuring yourself of what the learner experience is going to be like. And that will set the foundations for these types of programs. But to spread that further then is what I think we're looking at here.
Yeah, then sort of is there cooperation at the moment with the rest of the world.
Those who need to learn, you know, look at the good practice. We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, but there is a challenge with the good practice. The good practices are good in their own context.
Yeah.
When you move that,
but the elements and the principles.
The good practice becomes good because of so many different factors that are making it a success. Once you move it to a different context, most of the time it doesn't work. And they would make a reference, oh, you know, we learned from that system, X system, which is really good, but it's not working in this context.
Well, how can we make it work?
Exactly.
I suppose that's where there has to be further analysis.
Exactly. That is why it's the contextual peculiarities that we need to consider when we talk about different policies or good practices traveling across the borders or context or jurisdictions.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think we need to look more to the learner, to the student.
Absolutely.
The learner voice, and, you know, get their feedback about their experience. You know, I can only talk for my own children who graduated from college and who have had international experiences. Some of them were good, some of them were not so good. And some of their friends have had, you know, different types of experiences, but there's learning there. And I often find, I say, did you give that feedback? Have you given feedback through the department about how you got on or how you didn't get on, as the case may be? So I think maybe we neglect our learner from time to time.
With conscious of time, if we perhaps turn to
International organizations.
to international organisations, reflections on. I mean, yes, which to a large extent based on peer learning and sharing practice. But anyway, first Thomas and then Xingling, and then we'll open the floor to some questions.
Well, that was actually going to be my question, which is, what on earth's name, given what you've described needs to be done, speaking, you know, on behalf of the OECD, how on earth can we possibly be helpful, right? What is it we can do? I mean, I'm very much aware that the guidelines that were promulgated are very abstract. The reason that no one takes objection to them is because they're so abstract, there's nothing to object to. And you know, you're calling for capacity building, you're calling for sort of sharper, more granular guidelines that are better adapted to the specificities and context. But that's not what OECD, UNESCO standards do, right? And the fact that they're this old means they can't be adapted very often, so they can't respond to change very easily, right? So I guess the challenge for the others is, how can we help? Like, what within a new framework, where in fact you have the national and the networks, the network capabilities of the quality assurance bodies, what remains to be done by the international organizations that is a useful addition to what you're doing?
Basically, we're talking about UNESCO and OECD
Yeah,
are setting the
sure.
soft regulations, and they are guidelines, and basically we think that this is not enough. We have to move to the implementation level. Let's go back again to who is the beneficiary of it, the student, right? And what the student interested in is the recognition of the qualification awarded. So let's think about the mechanisms that link these guidelines, take it to link it with the recognition, link it to the regional implementation of the regional conventions, of the global convention on recognition of qualification. What is the link between these guidelines that are there and the recognition? I think that could be made explicit. The role of quality assurance in this recognition procedure could be made more explicit, because once this is set by a soft regulator like OECD or UNESCO, countries are following it. Actually, they are following it. True implementation mechanisms are lacking. There is still need in implementation, and that's a different story. You could also be engaged in the implementation mechanisms. But again, linking those guidelines to the recognition, what is the link? It's not yet clear. We're saying you have to practice the same thing as you are doing in your country, but what is the guarantee of recognition? So just building on this to benefit the student. Let's look at the student and what is it, what does he want, what does she want? What is necessary for that student?
Okay. Xingling, sort of thinking also, I mean, there's the issue also of cooperation between the global regions, right? So there's cooperation that's going on within North America, South America, within Europe, and so on. But then, is there UNESCO is a global organization? I mean, is there a role in sort of bringing those regions together? Because a lot of the detail work, the implementation work, is perhaps happening in those regional networks. What's your sort of perspective on that in general?
Yeah, we've been talking about good practices in context. I can tell you a bit more about what is happening at UNESCO as good practices in supporting this cross-border quality assurance, cross-border higher education provision. I just mentioned the 5 local regional conventions on the recognition of qualifications and also the global convention. Those are one of the key areas of UNESCO's work on standard setting through the normative instruments. And then around these instruments, we have regional committees and dedicated colleagues working on these. And those are the platforms for capacity development, for these kind of dialogues. And also, the conference today is actually one example. And then the second part that UNESCO is working, same capacity development. We do have this regional structure and also UNESCO field offices working on quality assurance. And I can give you an example. From 2017, I've been working on a project, the UNESCO Shenzhen Funds in Trust project, on strengthening quality assurance in higher education in Africa. So we help build new national quality assurance agencies and support the newly established quality assurance agencies to develop the tools and frameworks they can use for their national higher education. And the third part is about international and regional benchmarking. We talk about good practices, but it's important for you to give the quality assurance professional the chance to go to another country to see why this is working in that context, what they can take from there. So these kind of regional networks and international networks, we've been working with Inquiry as well, is what UNESCO has been doing. And the third part, I will be very quick, is to act as a platform for international collaboration. It's not just UNESCO working in this arena. It's actually more the countries working on cross-border higher education. And we can only support for this general cause that we all believe in. So we're building up the platforms like the World Higher Education Conference, and also there has been 3 regional conventions in the Africa region for the implementation of the Addis Convention that builds up momentum for the development and harmonization of recognition process in Africa. So those what UNESCO has been doing. And another important thing, we talk about information. Many of you mentioned this, the transparency and understanding each other's system. So a very important role of international organizations and international associations is to provide the full transparent information for our students so they can make a choice in terms of where they want to study. Angela, you mentioned that they're voting with their feet, but without the information, they might be voting with the wrong feet. So this is important, and UNESCO has been working with the International Association of Universities to develop the world database on higher education. And we also have an institute, the UIS, on statistics for higher education. So this is what has been doing in-house. And like Thomas said, you said the right thing. The reason we're here today is to listen from you in terms of how you think we can do better, or how do you think we can support better to develop the cross-border higher education for the internationalization of higher education for the students. Thank you.
Thanks. Should we just take some questions from the audience? I'm conscious of time. There's quite a lot. I've seen the gentleman over here with his hand up from earlier on, so maybe if you could just say very quickly who you are and then ask your question. I don't know if, yeah, we have a microphone coming towards you. I can't see anything.
Turn that
First.
on.
Thank you. Douglas Blackstock. I'm the president of the European Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education and spent the previous 20 years in the UK's Quality Assurance Agency. So I'll offer some thoughts from my perspective as an ENCA president, but also in my experience in quality assurance. Achim, I haven't read your paper because I think it only went online yesterday, and you and I have collaborated on a paper previously on innovation and quality assurance and avoiding overly rigid interpretations of what that should be. I would caution about the needs for new standards and for new rules, because I think there are better ways of going about it, and some of it in that last contribution I think was helpful. We have 49, now 47 countries active in the European higher education area, and still we have around 15 or 16 countries or regions that aren't yet fully complied with the European standards and guidelines 20 years on. We've got 2 projects, one just ending, one just beginning, to help agencies get to the point where they can meet the European standards. To throw something else over the top of that, I'm not sure is helpful. We've just had the development of the African standards and guidelines. We're just finishing working, we're collaborating with agencies in the ASEAN region as they're implementing their framework that was mentioned in Akim's slide. There's lots of cross-regional activity already. The HACA project in Africa, the SHARE project. 2 weeks ago I signed a memorandum with CIATHIS, the Latin American network that's developed out of the Guatemala Declaration. That cross-regional fertilization, I think, is much more productive than international rules. I think UNESCO, OECD, could do a really important job in helping and supporting, for example, the colleagues in Africa as they're developing the implementation of the ASG. I think that would be more constructive. There's also so much more going on that is going underneath the water. So in my own agency, just before, the last couple of years before lockdown, and indeed the previous years, I welcomed over 40 delegations from other countries to come to learn what we were doing about quality assurance. I see MOU partners here from Egypt and Bahrain, and colleagues I've worked with in Armenia and Georgia and other countries. There's lots of networking and sharing of practice that's going on, and there's a really well-established network that is building trust and confidence. So I think if you can support bilateral developments, cross-regional developments, we'll get much further down the line of building that trust and confidence than another layer of rules for people to work over the top of them.
Send that to
Thank you all, and thank you, Douglas, because I was going to say the same. Because when I had already attended lots of discussion about transnational education. I'm Nadia Badrawi, and I am the president of the Arab Network for Quality Assurance, and I am acting actually in the advisory board of ACTIS Transnational Education in Britain. So I have attended lots of these conferences, actually. I second the UNESCO. You should actually collaborate all this. There is DAAD, you know DAAD, the German one, British Council, they have guidelines. The ACTIS have a benchmark for quality assurance of transnational education. Shea was working on this. I mean, this is very good that you can collaborate with all this organization, because lots of work have been done, and it's time to implement. We have lots of guidelines, but implemented. This is what I'm think that UNESCO can do that.
Yeah. Got quite a lot. Gentleman here, and then you. Yeah. And then I've noted the others, but can you bring forward the microphone?
Hello, thanks a lot. Rudy Osman from Union of Exiled Students based on Paris, France. Actually, what I heard, it's amazing when I just heard it. And I said, I told myself that the most population who are cross-border, they are exiles and asylum seekers. But what's happened in reality, there is a kind of equivalence and not recognition, which happened in European countries especially. There is EQPR, that's the passport of qualification for refugees, and there is like a national initiative like INICNARIC in France, and I think it's existed in most of European countries. What's happened is that there is no legal recognition. It's all the time like a small attestation that said that, okay, we just said that in your country you study this, this, this. In our country, in France, for example, it's just like you are just only studying this, so it could be like third year in a French education system or European system. I think the solution is really to give this legal value to this all qualifications, and not only to say that it's equivalence, but more than recognition. And in this way, we can really make a difference, because what's happening now is just like, even universities, they don't accept it. No employers, companies, societies accept this, this kind of documents. because it's not a recognition. It's just only kind of equivalence. So I think with you and with the UNESCO, to work with this recognition, like by law, it's become really benefits for everybody, because we have these systems in all countries, especially in European countries, but without any legal value. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So, Aki. Okay. Well, this was.
Dankert Fede from Norway. It's very interesting, this discussion, because on the one hand side, I think many are questioning the guidelines that was adopted in 2005 are not clear enough. They are not setting in a way the concrete way how to help. On the other hand, it's also said that we don't need more concrete rules and procedures at the international level. I think what was said by the colleague from UNESCO Hong Kong, if I understood correctly, or Bangkok.
Headquarters, Paris.
Yeah, in Paris, okay.
Thank you.
That it needs to be seen together with the work and the follow-up on the global convention, because these are two sides of the same coin, I believe. And like it or not, there's going to be work on deciding on the implementation procedure on the global convention. And there will be a committee, and I think a lot of the questions that was been raised here today belongs into that implementation committee that will be set up. And in this room, early this morning, it was said that the global convention probably will enter into force before the summer, and then an expert committee will be set up. And I think these questions, these challenges, and how far you should go in the kind of normative work belongs to that committee. Of course, with the inputs from all other organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senor.
Hello, Jaime Roser from UNESCO Institute for Higher Education. You started the session speaking about, okay, it's been many years since 2005. What has changed in the sector since? And perhaps one of the trends has been an increased demand for micro-credentials and all sort of modular forms of tertiary education. My question is there room for an international recognition of micro-credentials, at least at regional level? And the second question is there a demand for it?
I wonder about, given Ireland's
forward.
pioneering work
Yeah.
on
Want to say what are
Micro-credentials?
Yeah.
Well, in relation to micro-credentials, we certainly have developed a number of projects, I suppose, around micro-credentials. Within the QQI space, we have developed micro-credentials with our providers who have come forward and developed programs which lead to very short programs, but these programs are recognized within the framework. They carry credit and they carry a level on our framework of qualifications. So that's one, I suppose, main school of thought. And these will be strong from a point of view of transition or transfer into other learning programs. There are other programs that are being developed which would be termed micro-credentials as well in our university sector, and we're not certain yet, I suppose, of what their standing will be. They will certainly have a standing within professional recognition and CPD type recognition, but we're not certain how they will be recognized in the longer term if people take that learning back with them into a formal education setting. Recognition of prior learning obviously is one of the methodologies that is being proposed, but my own personal view would be we need to be careful about creating another industry for recognition. We have a good recognition structure through our regional and global, hopefully, recognition conventions, but recognition of prior learning is another type of recognition, and we need to mind it as well as to what we are going to be getting involved with. So micro-credentials can fit within that for recognition purposes, but I do think we need to future-proof whatever work we're doing to prepare for those awards or qualifications that are out there that we don't know about yet, because they're like micro-credentials have come our way. Maybe there will be other types that we haven't foreseen at this point.
Does Does anyone else have?
I think I can actually go back to the point made by Douglas and also president of the Arab Network on Quality Assurance. I'm very happy that you raised all those guidelines that exist, all the standards that exist. For me, it's not a big issue. It seems like, I can give a metaphor if I may. It's like we're standing at crossroads. And those guidelines and standards, they are the road signs. Many of them might be pointing to the same direction. And it's very good when we see, I actually compare the guidelines, and you can see information, transparency, international collaboration. Those are common elements that all these guidelines agree on. And they come to this world at a sequence. We have the OECD guideline in 2005, NQA 2007. We also have ESG, ASG. All the guidelines that came into being also show the development of quality assurance and cross-border higher education. The new things that came into being, as we're standing at crossroads, there might be cross bridges, highways that make the road more and more complicated. So when we have conflicting road signs, it's time for us to sit down and talk about it. Given the destination that we're heading for, which road we're going, if they're conflicting. If they're pointing to the same direction, perfect. It means consensus. It means the social capital that is already built. So it's not a big issue for me. And then coming back to the president of the Arab Quality Network, and I'm pretty sure you're working with UNESCO Beirut office. And we also have recently the Regional Convention for the Arab region being updated 22nd of February this year, if I remember correctly. So all the things are in the development process. And coming back to the point raised by the gentleman on refugees, UNESCO does implement a UNESCO qualification passport for the refugees. It has been piloted in Zambia and now in other countries. We have colleagues working on the passport here, and then if you want, you can talk more about it. It's a very important issue. And this is also being written in the Global Convention for the recognition of qualifications for refugees. We need this paper. The qualification passport is a piece of paper, but it needs to be connected with employers, with the policymakers in the institutions so they can be recognized. So you can use this passport to get access to employment and academic development. Yeah, I'll stop here.
May I?
Yes, Akim wanted to make a point, so just very quickly.
Yeah, quickly to the question what these international organizations could do. I think that the reaction of the two regional networks, NQA and Untitled, gave evidence about the relevance of the region as a level for soft policy making and collaboration. And I was not talking about having a second level above them, my goodness. But what I see is that we have a mismatch of the level of policy slash soft policy making and the level which is the region, the national level and the region. And on the other side, the level of the issues with cross-border higher education, which is the global level. And what I think would be important to have a driver bringing those regions together to try to come to an agreement how cross-border higher ed should be addressed in quality assurance. Because last sentence, and I think I may say this as a former NQA president, it would not be appropriate that NQA or any other regional network would tell the other regions how quality assurance in cross-border should look like, because NQA might cover many sending countries and the others might cover many receiving countries. So these networks need to come together to agree on how to tackle the issues in quality of cross-border provision, and bringing these two together, this might be the role of the international organizations.
Yeah. Bravo. But just a statement here.
Grazie.
Just a statement here. We have made a reference to a lot of guidelines, standards from all different regions, networks, name it. Have you ever measured those standards against the relevance to the current needs? What is the relevance? What is the impact? I mean, those standards, guidelines, they were developed like years ago. Now look what we are facing now. What is the relevance? This is the point where we should now get together and discuss, including the cross-border, which you have done basically the job on the relevance, whether they are yet relevant. Yes, they are relevant, but the implementation mechanisms are maybe lacking or something else is lacking. But the same refers to all other standards and guidelines. To what extent are they relevant? Let's start discussion around this topic.
Okay, we'll take one last question from the audience because we're really a little bit over time. But maybe, yeah.
So I am Olivier Pium. I am based in Dakar. I am the regional advisor for TVET for Africa in Dakar. So I just go in the last question that was related really to the relevance. Because for me, in the way that we used to work is to take time to discuss about the issue with all those who are in the ecosystem. So for this kind of issue, for example, the process, as you hear the consultants say, we need to have the point of view of the agency, quality assurance agency, the point of view of the learners, the point of view also for what I used to say, provider, institution provider. So when we take all this, we are able to really know what is the issue, and then we can evaluate the relevance of what we bring. And it's after this step that we can go now to the question of what is the good practice. Because when we have this kind of issue, we could be able now to discuss with other stakeholders and say what are the good practices. And based on the good practice, we have to do what we say success factor. Because we can have a good practice, but there are many reasons why it's a good practice. So you need to know what are these success factors before sharing with the other stakeholder and with the other country. So for me, we need to really go step by step to ensure the relevance. This is what I wanted to share also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I get the message we can extend by 5 minutes, so I'll just take, we'll just take 2 last questions then. So I say one that side and one that side. Colin, I think.
Thank you. It's Colin Tuck from the European Quality Assurance Register, ECHA. I was wondering, I came back from a meeting where we discussed cross-border higher education in the Bologna process yesterday, and there was a scary amount of countries who said that assessing the outgoing cross-border higher education was not a part of their national quality assurance system's remit. So and I'm wondering, I have some sympathy for the call on not developing new standards, not developing new guidelines, or not developing anything more to all the robust things we have already. But maybe do we just need in some places to say more clearly who is responsible ultimately for implementing everything in and implementing it in the full scope and not implementing it only for part of the system.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Yes.
Yeah, so hello, I'm Claudius Melys, the representative of Lithuania in the United Nations as a youth. So I would like to focus on the question of this discussion, which was about protecting students. And you already mentioned in your just sayings that students is one of the key points of what kind of different documents we have, because this is the receiver of this quality assurance cycle. So I'm really interested, what are your thoughts of how now youth organization, or even just youth as it is, youth researchers of UNESCO, different global organizations, youth representatives are involved in quality assurance and in global perspective? Because we have this in I'm from Europe, so I know that in Europe system, they're involved quite well in some ways. There always could be better solutions. But what do you see? What could be better beneficial idea of implementing more? And I do not like the theme, protecting students. I think that the next step should be involving students in global perspective of quality assurance in global perspectives. And I also agree that we have totally too much documents of different systems. And I think we should only revise them and to see them, because I also been working with the quality assurance of European University Alliance. So that's why I just want to mention this. So what would be your thoughts about the student involvement into the global perspective? Thank you.
Angela, I'm conscious you mentioned that point.
Yeah, well,
very
again,
quickly, because we have the interpreters are leaving.
I'm speaking from my own experience here in terms of what we would be doing in Ireland, and we certainly have what we call our learner representatives on our embedded within our quality assurance processes, where we have student representatives involved in our reviews of institutions, and they have a voice, and they have a strong voice, because we provide them with training in advance, we develop them and give them the capacity building, you might say, that they will need to be able to contribute, and they are really, really useful to us as an organization in relation to, you know, whether they see what is going on is quality in education and training. So that would be the Irish experience, and again, it's a simple enough model, you know. The institutions who are our stakeholders would probably nominate students. Students will apply, come through the process. They have to be students within our education system across and representative of the education system, but they do participate actively. And obviously our panel members who would be responsible for engaging in the quality process will need to give them the voice that they will have during a review of an institution to give that real important feedback.
And there's a provision in the OECD-UNESCO guideline on how the student bodies can get involved.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have to wrap up now. Thank you all very much for coming, and thanks for the discussion and the live discussion. Thanks to everyone on the panel and presenters.
Thank you very much.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you.